As the new year progressed, the carnage continued in the various theatres of war that had been opened up in 1914. On the Western Front, the two sides pounded each other relentlessly, while in the East, both suffered through the Russian winter before the Central Powers won significant gains in the summer. For Allied leaders, the entry into the War of the Ottomans in October 1914 presented an added problem. The Central Powers also had decisions to make. They needed to decide how best to split their forces between the Western and Eastern fronts. Although the Allies were soon to become preoccupied with Gallipoli, they began the year focusing on fighting in Belgium and northern France. Battles at Artois and Champagne resulted in losses for both sides before the spring campaign concluded with an Allied offensive in the north at Ypres, where gas was used for the first time. After regrouping and resupplying through a quiet summer, heavy British losses in the autumn resulted in the appointment of General Douglas Haig. But his arrival did little to alter the stalemate, leaving the two opposing armies occupying pretty much the same positions in December as they had done at the start of the year. As the trenches settled into deadlock, Germany looked to weaken Britain elsewhere, intensifying their U-boat campaign in the North Sea and the North Atlantic. This targeted neutral and passenger shipping sailing to Britain with supplies, and in early May, despite US warnings, the British liner RMS Lusitania was sunk off the southern coast of Ireland. Among the dead were over 120 US citizens, with the backlash forcing Germany to suspend its submarine campaign against passenger ships. On the Eastern Front, a series of German victories, most notably again at the Masurian Lakes, left Russia in chaos. Poor leadership and bitter infighting within his hierarchy forced the Tsar to take personal charge of his army in September. War in the East was more mobile than the one in the West, but just as bloody, with millions dead on both sides. With seemingly no answer on the Western Front, Allied politicians turned their attention to the Eastern Mediterranean. There a plan was hatched to take the Dardanelles, the 38-mile-long stretch of water that connected the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara, the gateway to Istanbul itself. The principal advocate of this plan was Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, and its failure forced his resignation from the cabinet at the end of the year. He was to spend much of 1916 serving as an officer on the Western Front before returning to frontline politics in 1917. To make the Dardanelles safe for shipping, Allied forces would have to take out the gun positions on the mountainous Gallipoli Peninsula to the west. Two serious and costly attempts to do this were repelled by strong Turkish defenders, with a general withdrawal ordered in August. The Gallipoli campaign proved to be an unmitigated disaster, resulting in one of Britain's most humiliating defeats ever, leaving 22,000 soldiers dead. In addition, 27,000 French troops died, while around 10,000 ANZAC troops from Australia and New Zealand also gave up their lives. The last Allied troops were finally to leave the Gallipoli Peninsula at the beginning of 1916. By the end of 1915, war was being fought on the Western Front, the Eastern Front, in the Balkans, Egypt, Southern and East Africa, the Middle East, and at sea. Hundreds of thousands of young men had lost their lives or been injured in the Great War thus far. In 1916, still more were to join them. 1916 opened with both sides desperate for a breakthrough and ended with the year having witnessed two of the most bloody and attritional battles of the war. The key theatre was in the West, where German generals were most anxious to make progress. In simple terms, they knew that the campaign of 1915 had killed so many young French soldiers that France was suffering a severe manpower crisis. They also knew that Britain had brought in compulsory conscription in January 1916. Consequently, they chose to attack the strategically important town of Verdun on the River Meuse, close to Luxembourg, before the arrivals of these British conscripts. German generals knew that victory would open up the road to Paris. The Battle of Verdun began towards the end of February with an enormous German artillery bombardment of French positions protecting the city. Over 1 million shells were fired on the first day alone. As a result, early German gains were considerable, and this resulted in the recall of the renowned General Pétain. A second German attack was launched in early March, but as wave after wave of German soldiers were driven back, his motto, "Ils ne passeront pas," they will not pass, became the rallying cry for the whole of France. Before the last shot was fired at Verdun in December 1916, about 300,000 young men had lost their lives. Ironically, General Pétain, the subsequent leader of Vichy France during World War II, was convicted of treason after the war for ordering the surrender of Paris in 1914 to the Nazis. Meanwhile, as the body count on both sides steadily rose, thousands more showed the symptoms of the newly diagnosed condition of shell shock. Plans for an all-out attack in the northern BEF sector of the Western Front had been agreed to at an Allied conference held at the Château of Chantilly, the French general headquarters, at the end of 1915. However, this had to be delayed because of the German offensive at Verdun, and so was not launched until the height of the summer. The Battle of the Somme, fought across 40 miles of the front around the Somme River, was to last for 4.5 months and was to be the war's bloodiest battle. At 0 hour, set for 7:30 a.m. on the 1st of July 1916, the guns of the week-long artillery barrage that were supposed to have cleared the German trenches went quiet. The order to charge over the top was then issued, and this was followed by about 120,000 BEF soldiers, men from Britain, Ireland, and the Empire, on that first morning. Alongside them, about 30,000 French soldiers attacked further south, near the Somme River itself. The slaughter began almost immediately and continued all day until some 20,000 BEF troops lay dead in no man's land, cut down by German machine gunners as they reached the miles and miles of barbed wire that a week of artillery fire had failed to destroy. These machine gunners, who had taken shelter in deep concrete bunkers during the artillery attack, left a further 40,000 injured on the battlefield. In September, tanks were used in battle by the Allies for the first time in a major new offensive ordered by General Haig. In reality, however, these new instruments of war, which were to play such an important role in the Second World War, were largely ineffective, with many breaking down almost immediately after deployment. Eventually, the battle ground to a halt in the middle of November in the mud and the rain of late autumn. Despite the loss of some 600,000 men, the Allied advance never managed to gain more than about 10 miles of enemy territory. Although the Battle of the Somme did not inflict the major defeat of the German army that had been its major objective, it did relieve the French army further south at Verdun. And crucially also, although the 600,000 German soldiers killed or wounded in the battle was of a similar number to those lost by the Allies, these were men that the Germans could ill afford to lose. In a war where the soldiers were the raw material of battle, Germany, especially after the entry into the War of the USA a year later, was to run out of men quicker than its enemy. General Haig, who had ordered the continuous frontal attacks on the German trenches for so long, suffered furious criticism in the British press for his actions, while the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, was forced to resign in December 1916, partly at least because of the carnage at the Somme. Asquith was replaced by David Lloyd George, who himself had replaced Lord Kitchener in June 1916 as Minister of War. Lord Kitchener, whose mustachioed face and pointing finger had become famous on recruiting posters all over Britain, had drowned off the Orkneys when the ship carrying him on a mission to see Tsar Nicholas had hit a German mine. While fighting at Verdun and the Somme claimed the lives of thousands of men, campaigns on other fronts, in the East, Italy, the Balkans and the Middle East, were killing still more. In the summer, Austro-Hungarian and Italian troops clashed again at the Sixth Battle of Isonzo, soon after Italy had declared war on Germany. This sixth battle within a year was fought again for control of the mountain passes around the Isonzo River, as Italian forces tried to break through into Austro-Hungary. Earlier, Austrian troops had held the high ground to thwart off a number of Italian attacks in horrific winter conditions, where frostbite and avalanches killed as many men as the enemy. Joint casualties there approached 250,000. In July, a Serbian force of 100,000 reinforced an Allied army at Salonika. Their northward push in August gained only a few miles and came at a huge cost in lives. In the Middle East, the war saw fighting in the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Palestine, and Arabia. In Mesopotamia, an Anglo-Indian army was besieged at Kut, 100 miles south of Baghdad, suffering 20,000 casualties before surrendering in April. Further west, Ottoman forces moved into Arabia, while in Egypt, British troops pushed eastwards across the Sinai Desert. In August, a German-Ottoman attack cut the British-run railway link with the Mediterranean. This persuaded Allied generals in Cairo to redouble their efforts to recapture Palestine. As the year ended, the Allies had once again been able to restore their ascendancy. With the Ottomans in retreat, T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, was sent from Cairo to Jeddah in December 1916 to help foment a local Arab revolt against Ottoman rule that had begun in the summer. Lawrence knew the region well. He had lived there since 1910 as an archaeologist and in 1914 had joined the army to help with surveys and mapping. Reports of his work, alongside the Arab army of Hussein bin Ali, were to give a sense of romance far removed from the trenches of the Western Front when reported the following year in the British press. 1916 was also the year when the only battle in which the Anglo-German naval rivalry was played out. This was when the two great fleets faced each other in the North Sea, 60 miles or so from Jutland, the long peninsula that makes up mainland Denmark. The Battle of Jutland began in the afternoon of the 31st of May 1916, after the British surprised the Germans, having intercepted encoded radio messages. In all, some 250 warships took part, enormous battleships and cruisers facing off in one of the most critically important naval battles of the 20th century. Early skirmishes resulted in the German fleet gaining the upper hand, and for 2 hours the British advance flotilla was chased northwards. At about 6 p.m. though, the British reached their main fleet, and for an hour the two massive navies engaged each other in open battle. Both sides suffered huge losses before night fell and battle was discontinued. At dawn, the fleets clashed again briefly, before both admirals commanding sailed to the safety of their home ports. In terms of ships and lives lost, it was the British fleet that was to suffer the most at the Battle of Jutland. Over 6,000 British sailors died in the battle, more than twice the German casualties. 14 Royal Navy warships were lost, including HMS Queen Mary, carrying a crew of 1,286 sailors, of which only 20 survived. Yet despite this, the British fleet itself was not destroyed and still dominated the waters of the North Sea. This meant that the German fleet rarely ventured out again after Jutland, meaning that despite the appalling loss of life, the sailors of the Royal Navy in May 1916 had ensured British naval dominance. In simple terms, this meant that Britain, an island nation, would not be starved out of the war. By December 1916, some 5 million had died in the conflict that many had once thought would be over by Christmas 1914. The war that many in 1913 had felt Europe needed to reset internal relations and great power spheres of influence had led to carnage unparalleled in history. On the 30th of December 1916, Allied leaders rejected an offer of peace negotiations from the Central Powers, convinced that better terms would come in 1917. As a result, the war and its killing moved into its fourth calendar year, the new year bringing with it more bloodshed on the Western Front and elsewhere, as well as the collapse of the Tsar's armies in the East, leading to upheaval and revolution in Russia.